Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Louisiana's passion for football and politics combined this past week, even though voters in a traditionally red state were overwhelmed by a crimson tide. We'll look at some of the key results tonight, as well as the Saints at the halfway mark of their regular season. We'll also follow up to last week's church sex abuse revelations and look at one ballot issue in which rival factions were actually unified. And we will remember a respected New Orleans journalist. Our Informed Sources tonight, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Gordon Russell, managing editor for Investigations, The New Orleans Advocate. And Ramon Antonio Vargas, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. I'm going to go over to Errol first, take a look at some of the election results from this past Tuesday.
Yeah, there was only one statewide election that involved candidates, and that was a special election for Secretary of State. It wasn't a great exercise in democracy. It was more of an exercise in the way that the numbers fall, but the results were a bit of a surprise. Kyle Ardoin, who is the interim Secretary of State, ran first, but look at these results, and you'll notice a trend here that you see. Whenever you have an election, which is pretty much of a low-profile election, that most voters really don't know who these people are, when that happens, party registration means a lot more. And so people who were inclined towards the Democratic Party will vote for the D, even if they don't know who the person is. And people who are inclined to the Republicans will vote for the R. If you look at the bottom, people are inclined to no party. There aren't that many of them, so that's not a strong political selling point. What you see is that Kyle Ardoin, who is the incumbent, sort of, he's the interim incumbent, finished first. And then, kind of a surprise, the two people who were Democrats finished second and third. Neither of them are high profile. And the person who finished second, Gwen Collins Green, she's an attorney. She's from East Feliciana Parish. She works in the clerk's office there. Her campaign budget was like around $3,000, and so she hardly spent anything at all. Renee Fontenot-Free at least had the support of the Louisiana Democratic Party and had worked in the Secretary of State's office, so her credentials were a little bit more solid. And so the question is, well, okay, so you got these two Democrats here. Why did one surpass the other? And no one knows for sure, but our friend Jeremy Alford suggested in his newsletter that maybe alphabet, made the difference. That sometimes when you have a long list of people, and so that may have been an advantage.
Placement on the ballot.
Yeah. And so some other, if you put that ballot up again, please. There were some other people who I think it was expected would do better, like Julia Stokes, who's from the Kinner area. You'd have thought she had the whole Jefferson Parish, New Orleans, and St. Tammany all for herself, but it's just that the way that the elections fell. Rick Edmonds is a state representative from the Baton Rouge area. So a couple of state representatives who you thought would have gotten more votes. And so it's really an election where I think people say party doesn't matter. Sometimes in certain elections it does. And this raises the question about, well, how did John Bel Edwards get elected? Because you remember he was the lone Democrat running against David Vitter, but that was a high-profile election in which there was a lot of attention paid to the issues and to David Vitter. But this one, you don't have a high-profile election. But if you add up all of the Republican votes, it's about 61%. And if you assume in the runoff that that's going to be the total, and it pretty much works out that way in terms of
the way it usually comes down.
Yeah, in terms of the way that the votes are distributed. You would think that Ardoin is in very good shape going into the runoff, especially being it's going to be a low turnout election. I mean, there's hardly anything on the ballot, and Republicans tend to be more of chronic voters, and so it's probably a good thing for him. The one other thing I just wanted to mention is that there's a lot of talk around the nation about how important this off-year election was in terms of the direction of Congress and the country. Louisiana had no role in that because our two senators were not up for re-election this time. All 6 of our representatives were a sure thing to be elected, and even if they weren't, there wouldn't have been a change in party. And so we were not part of the national move. Probably about the most effect that this had in Louisiana is that, in effect, we lost Steve Scalise as being the majority whip. And he'll be the minority whip, I guess, presumably, but it's not the same kind of thing. And so it's a minor step back there. But and so it wasn't that dynamic of a ballot, but still politics.
Big turnout anyway for an election with relatively low interest, I'd
Right.
say.
It was upper 40s or something?
It was near 48%, I think.
And I have a hunch. I think the issue that you're going to talk about the jury verdicts, I think that brought a lot of people to the polls.
I think it did. I mean, I would guess that a lot of people were voting just because there's a lot of anger or enthusiasm about what's going on in Washington, and even though we weren't going to really change any of that by voting the other day, people felt more passionate, I feel like, about voting than they do in some calmer times.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing. I think the whole Kavanaugh situation turned on a lot of people to politics, no matter which side you were on. And you're right. I think people thought they were going to go vote and make a statement, but there was nothing on their ballot that would have allowed them to make a statement about that.
Right. I mean, you could vote against somebody or for them or whatever, but you knew that it wasn't going to change anything.
I mean, when you're voting for clerk of court, you're not making a
right. Well, you could vote for or against your congressman, for instance, but I mean, it wasn't going to probably make a difference whether your congressman got reelected or not.
As far as Secretary of State goes, it's to a runoff now, Republican and Democrat, and Kyle Ardoin, who was, as you said, the interim Secretary of State, at first said he was not going to run until he said he would, and so now he's in the runoff.
Right.
Okay. All right. Over to Gordon now. As Errol mentioned, the unanimous jury constitutional amendment, that passed strongly, and it had this unified coalition that was sort of unlikely.
Yeah, it's something you don't see that often in Louisiana, especially in the polarized times we live in right now. But we did a little analysis after the fact. It carried in 61 of 64 parishes. And this is something that started off as kind of a pet cause of liberals, but eventually grew to be a big bipartisan cause. And this is the move to require unanimous jury verdicts in Louisiana, which historically is currently only requires 10 of 12 jurors for a valid verdict. And the reason this was kind of a pet cause of liberals is because this is it had discriminatory origins. It came up in the Jim Crow era, and it was thought to be a way to both deprive blacks who are on juries, black jurors, of their voices potentially if they disagreed with the verdict, and also it just made it easier to for prosecutors to put people in prison, and our prison population is disproportionately African American. So it's kind of been over the years a pet cause of the left, but what you saw happen this year, which was kind of remarkable, was that the cause was kind of joined by a lot of conservative legislators and conservative groups. The Koch brothers got involved in this. Louisiana Family Forum, which is a very conservative evangelical group. In some sense, it was the same.
Senator Cassidy, even.
Yeah, he came out for it. That's right. And honestly, hardly any politicians came out against it. Initially, you had a little more pushback against it from the district attorneys and so forth, and then the district attorneys decided to be neutral. So what you ended up with was this coalition that was pretty amazingly broad for Louisiana, and it was actually a lot like the coalition that we had last year that did the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act, which was intended to lower our incarceration rate. So what we found in our analysis after the vote the other day is that it still was a more popular cause among liberals. Like if you compared the parishes where Hillary Clinton did well or poorly versus how this thing did, it did best in the parishes that voted more for Hillary Clinton, and it did worse in the other ones. But it really did well across the board, including places like St. Tammany Parish, where it got more than 60% of the vote. And
so this was following up on the issue taken to the voters, following up on legislation that had been proposed by J.P. Morrell just this summer, just this past legislative session.
Right, and so just a few months ago in March when he proposed this, the way that this had to work was the legislature had to pass it by a 2/3 majority to put it on the ballot because it was a constitutional amendment. And when he proposed it back in March, it looked like, he thought it was a long shot. Everybody thought it was a long shot. And then it just gained a lot of momentum during the legislative session. And it barely got out of committee initially, but then it sort of snowballed. And some of that was the district attorneys deciding not to oppose it. I think my newspaper, The Advocate, published a long series about some of the negative impacts of this law and the discriminatory effects of it. that may have played a role, and in the end, you ended up with hardly anyone opposing it.
So as the voters became more informed, they decided to take this action on it. It takes effect when?
So it takes effect. It's a little confusing. It's for crimes committed after January 1. So it'll take a little longer than that to take effect because there's sort of a pipeline between when a crime is committed and when a trial occurs. But so it'll be for cases involving crimes that occur after January 1.
But
So-
that's going to be grounds for appeals if someone is convicted under the old law, and they can say, well, they've changed the law.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be grounds for successful appeals, but I mean, I'm sure people will try that. I've talked to a lot of lawyers in the last few days about this, and there's a really high bar for retroactivity for even if something, there's actually a ruling that came out recently that found this law unconstitutional as well, but even if that ruling is upheld, I don't think it's going to have a retroactive impact.
So anyone facing trial for crimes committed before January 1st, 2019 are not going to have
Not
the
going to benefit
non-unanimous.
from this unless, one of the things we're looking into is there could be a situation where the district attorneys and the defense lawyers could say, look, the people have spoken on this, and they could ask for a jury to be instructed to be unanimous, and if the district attorney said, okay, it's possible that we could see some of that, but that's a little bit of a legal gray area between now and then.
I wonder what's going on in Oregon now, if people are saying,
Yeah, well,
even Louisiana's not doing this.
That's exactly what's going on, and they always sort of had Louisiana as cover of a sort, and now Oregon
They're the
is
only state.
all alone. And we're told there's a movement to change this in the upcoming legislative session there.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Gordon. Going to go over to Ramon now. And I think, Gordon, you were also involved in a piece that follow-up to last week. The Archdiocese released the 57 names of credible accusations against clergy. What have you found? What was the response in the ensuing days?
I mean, one of the ones that you kind of kept on running into as people reacted to the list is the question about why omit the names of credibly accused religious brothers, nuns, even lay employees of Catholic institutions, which certainly accusations have been made against them. They've been the subject of litigation that's been settled by their institutions or the Archdiocese, and so that was really, I think. That seems to be kind of the focus. It's like, okay, well, the clergy are out, and now, what about this other set of people? And there's a lot of people who have gone public and either share their story with you, just on not for it to be reported, but just that, and it's very detailed claims of being sexually abused by a nun or a brother who've been deceased, somebody who wasn't on the list, and it's really difficult for them to understand why those other names haven't been released. And of course, we did ask the Archdiocese, so why limit it to clergy? And the Archdiocese puts the onus on the religious orders to release those files, to craft that list, to release that list. One of the more interesting responses, I think, to the list coming out was. Jesuit High School, in a statement, made some mention that there might be additional steps of transparency coming from the Jesuit order that runs the school. Of course, there were some religious brother personnel who were in the middle of litigation that the order settled, and they also worked at the high school. So it'll be interesting to see, and I feel, it's always difficult to kind of predict these things, but certainly I feel that that's now become a focus of survivors, of their advocates and media.
You guys did a chart that demonstrates when the alleged offenses occurred, and then also when the accusation was made, when action was taken on it. What does that chart indicate to us?
I mean, the bulk of the abuse occurred during the tenures of Archbishop Hannon and Archbishop Brummel, and obviously, there's some exceptions, and they weren't. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was reported under. That the Archdiocese was necessarily made aware of it, though. Of course, there's some of those dates of when the Archdiocese was notified have been challenged, and we've documented it in stories. But yes, if there's one takeaway from that chart, is that the bulk of the abuse allegedly of the credible abuse occurred under the tenures of those two archbishops.
Which ended in 1988. Archbishop Hannon
About
wrapped up in
89, I think.
Yeah.
that's what it said.
One thing that was surprising was the orphanage on the West Bank, Hope Haven.
Sure.
I think there were 7 or 8 priests, 7 of them from the same order who were on that list. Was there any? I know there was some lawsuits back in that time. Was there anything that you've heard, any kind of consciousness or any kind of awareness within the archdiocese at that time?
No, I mean, I think that one of the big revelations was getting the names of some of the clergy that were implicated in that case, which obviously has gone back years. It was a subject of a settlement north of $5 million, I think in 2009, involving Hope Haven. And I mean, certainly if there's one concentration where this crisis really kind of disproportionately affected was that campus in Marrero. And certainly that one of there were 8 Salesian priests, including the founding principal of Archbishop Shaw High School. And so certainly that stood out.
I mean, I think that there's been other orphanages and places like that. They've often been hotbeds of abuse, which in a way it's sad but not surprising in a way, because pedophiles and people who prey on children. Here you've got a case where there's not a parent involved to stick up for this kid, and so I know there was a huge scandal in Canada some years back involving an orphanage in Newfoundland, and
It's just horrifying. It's beyond horrifying. Real quick, and you're out there talking to parishioners. Has it shaken the faith?
For some, certainly. I mean, I had a very telling interaction. I stopped in on a Saturday vigil mass the day after the release, and I think this couple told the story perfectly. You had a woman in her 70s who's, I'm sticking with my faith. My sister is a nun, and it's what I've known all my life, and I'm sticking with it. And her husband's reply to that was, I'm a Christian, I believe in God. And then he pointed at the church and said, I don't believe in that and there. And certainly the context was the abuse scandal. So I think that illustrated kind of the polar opposites of.
And that was at the parish in Metairie where George Brignac was.
And he was, of course, a deacon who at this point is strongly suspected of being a serial child abuser, a former deacon.
The whole thing just very, very disturbing and upsetting. All right, thanks a lot. Ramon, but now we're going to continue with you. A happier story, certainly, because the Saints are having a great season. But now they also have a problem.
Certainly a big splash. Yes, 7-1, lots of good energy, a favorable result in yesterday's Thursday night game with the Carolina Panthers losing, giving them, some wiggle room. If they drop a game, the standings will still be pretty similar in the division. Of course, Dez Bryant tearing his Achilles from reports. Final play of his first practice practice today with the Saints. He wasn't expected to have a role this weekend, but certainly I believe they're going to count on him moving forward. Especially to take some of the pressure off of Michael Thomas and give Drew Brees another option at wide receiver as we get deeper into the season. At the same time, I mean, 7-1 without Dez Bryant, and I feel that will be the message that will come through once the initial shock of losing such a big name in such a horrendous fashion, kind of when the dust settles on that.
Which reminds you of the Pelicans with Boogie Cousins at the end too, trying to make a playoff run. And but the fact that they were doing that kind of says that they were starting to think playoffs at this point, because this is the time of the year when the teams that are out of it start unloading players, and here they were trying to find someone like Dez Bryant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was a pretty low risk move. The deal wasn't at all prohibitive. Certainly he wasn't the only player that they were looking at to bring in to add depth to the wide receiver position. Michael Thomas is having a phenomenal year. Alvin Kamara is having a phenomenal year. The defense has been opportunistic. If they've given up a lot of yards and points, but they've been able to come up with stops and takeaways at big points that have allowed the Saints to win. But so I would expect. This is pure speculation. I no longer have not been the Saints reporter in a while. We have a guy, Nick Underhill, who does a great job at it, and Rod Walker. But certainly, I would expect that one of the someone else that they worked out. It would not be surprising to see them come in the building to try to help that wide receiver core out.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Thomas has really carried the load, and it hasn't seemed to bother him. I mean, he's still it's just hard to have one guy catch all the passes, and it seems like that's kind of the way it's been.
Sure, yeah, and like Brandon Marshall is a name to watch out for. Keenan Allen, those are Keenan Aiken. Those are two guys that were in the building recently working out when they went with Bryant. So I imagine that they will be getting phone calls if the reports that Dez Bryant tore his Achilles pan out.
So we're 7-1 right now. Saints, is that?
Yes,
that the
7-1, first place in the NFC after
seven in a row. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, that's
after
looking pretty
defeating the Los Angeles Rams, which was
undefeated.
yeah.
LA Rams.
What do you
point
think
victory.
happened at the very beginning when they had that humiliating loss to Tampa Bay? And then the following week, they really should have lost to Cleveland, except the guy missed 3 field goals. And so they started off badly. And they could just as easily be 5-3 now.
Yeah, I mean that's the NFL. I mean there have been seasons certainly where at this stage they're 4-4, 3-4, and you're a couple of breaks this way, a couple of plays go, they could be 6-2, they could be. So I think when it works out in your favor, you just take it. I mean it's the NFL, so there's really no, and I know it's a
they've been
cliche,
slow starters
but it's true.
too in
Yeah,
some years. I mean, and recently they've won, not easily I wouldn't say, but the games have been less games that you think like, but for this one play. Except for they had the one where the guy missed the extra point.
against the
Right.
Ravens.
Yeah.
But,
So second half of the season, as we move into, is going into the rest of the season looking good? Still strong? Maybe
yes,
some needs, but obviously that's why Dez Bryant was there. Well,
very
sorry
very
for
strong
Dez Bryant.
position. I mean,
That's, how unfortunate. That's got to be so
I don't-
upsetting and disheartening to a player.
I don't think there's anyone in the city that if you put the paper in front of them and said sign this and you're 7-1 at the midway point after a 10-point victory over the
Yeah.
previously undefeated Rams, I think everybody would take it.
All right.
Thanksgiving night, Saints on Thursday
right.
night football against Atlanta. The whole city will be
Oh
watching.
boy, yeah, right. We want that turkey to go down well. We don't want to have upset tummies. Okay, all right. Let's talk politics again. A little bit more politics because there was more on the ballot. The amendments, unanimous juries, just one of them.
Right.
Others, and then some other things too.
Well, there wasn't a lot of interest locally, but one election I was going to mention was the Plaquemine Parish Council, which we don't normally follow that closely, but it was interesting this year in part because it was animated by this fight between the oil and gas industry and these trial lawyers who are representing the parish in a lawsuit against the oil and gas industry. And both sides have been putting relatively a fair, quite a lot of money for a small place like that into these elections in hopes of electing a faction that's more friendly to them. And so the oil and gas folks want to elect a council that will decide to pull the plug on these lawsuits. These lawsuits, just to be clear, they're accusing the oil and gas of causing the coastline to erode, and there's a series of them around the state, but there's more of them in Plaquemine Parish than anywhere else. And those suits are expected to go to trial first, so they're kind of a test case for this whole theory of coastal erosion being partially the fault of oil and gas. So anyway, the upshot I think is that it seems like the trial lawyers won this round essentially, and that this is a little bit still in flux, but it seems like the council that was elected, a majority of them will probably be in favor of keeping the lawsuits alive. It's been a very tight split about which way that was going to go. On the other hand, the guy who came in first in the primary for parish president, I think, is an outspoken opponent of the lawsuit, so he may be able to do something. I don't think he can unilaterally kill them, but this may end up being a spat between the council and the parish president.
He had been on council before,
Yes,
wasn't he?
Kirk Lapine, yeah.
So there's a runoff between the
Him
incumbent and
and he got 48% of the vote, 48.4% of the vote. So it seems
against
like
Amos Cormier, who has
right,
been
who
the
got
parish president since his father.
27%. So it seems like Lapine is kind of in the driver's seat, but anything can happen in runoff. So we'll see.
Fantasy sports.
Fantasy sports. So this was this passed throughout most. This is a parish by parish election, and it passed in 47 of the 64 parishes. It's very complicated. What this means is the legislature is going to have to pass rules. It doesn't mean you can gamble on sports immediately, but they'll pass rules next year which will allow this. And then they have to set up this kind of geo-fencing, which to prevent people in the parishes where you can't do it from doing it. So
Because it's not statewide. It didn't
only-
get enough votes to be statewide.
It's a parish by parish decision. So if you live, but most of the parishes around here approved it. I think it's mostly North Louisiana where it didn't do as well.
But I think it needed to have 50 or above in all parishes to be
In order to be
parish-wide, and it didn't
yeah.
get that.
Right. So now it's got to be parish by parish,
Yeah.
which involves this kind of complex geocoding,
Okay.
geofencing. I'm
I was
sorry.
noticing one parish where it failed is Avoyelles Parish in central Louisiana, and that has an Indian casino. That has the Paragon Casino, and so I wonder if the Indian casino interests were out campaigning against that in those parishes.
Okay, let's talk about Frank Donzi, who passed away unexpectedly last weekend, and he was just a dean of political reporting and just so well respected here. Who wants to go first? Errol?
What the
Gordon?
word was.
Well, I mean, Frank was a dear, dear friend of mine and a mentor, both in sort of life and in journalism. I feel like he taught me most of what I know about New Orleans and its political history. He taught me how to be a reporter. He taught me how to get people to talk, how to trust you, how to. He's just so, and he's done this for a generation of reporters. He's just that you couldn't find a guy who's more respected among journalists. He may not be the most famous journalist in town, but he was somebody who, Ramon, I'm sure, learned at his side as well.
Yeah, Frank was like my uncle. I mean, he was somebody that you could ask him, hey, Frank, like, how should I word this? Who should I call for this? But certainly he was a guy that if you had I had these conversations with him. Frank, I have an opportunity to go to the Advocate and leave the Times-Picayune behind. What should I do? Frank, I'm about to be a dad. I'm scared out of my mind. What do I do?
Yeah.
And he would talk it through with you, and then at the end you always felt like you were going to be fine no matter what. And so yeah, I mean, many of us I feel have spent the past week missing him.
Oh yeah, loss felt so intensely by so many, and of course, not the least of which his family. Our sincere condolences to his family, his wife and daughters.
He was affected, am I right, Gordon, by that change up when they cut at the Times-Picayune.
Yeah.
And so he wound up getting a job at the Audubon Institute.
Yeah.
And one of his last actions was that day that the Jaguar escaped. And I remember watching that morning and kind of marveling about how well the zoo was handling this in terms of having a press conference almost instantly in the way they handled it. And I found out that it was really, I should have known all along, that it was really Donzi who got the people together and said, we got to do this, we got to provide information. And so he went out really kind of on the other side, being the information provider rather than information gatherer, and did a good job with that too.
And
Yeah.
just once again, very respected and well loved, and so sorry to hear of his loss. All right, real quick, you guys each have 10 seconds for looking ahead.
Whitney Hancock is moving into what we've known as the One Shell Square building, and so now it's going to be known as the Whitney Hancock building. So long, One Shell Square.
Okay, Gordon.
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and predict a huge turnout for Frank's funeral tomorrow and a long celebration of his life, hopefully afterwards by a lot of journalists and other people in this town who will be drinking a lot and telling stories about one of their favorite people.
Keeping in the tradition of the way he would throw parties, I understand that he was really, he could really throw a party. Okay.
If the trial of three St. Bernard Parish jail guards is on hold after one of them apparently shot themselves, and the trial is over. They're all accused of allowing an inmate to die of a blood clot, essentially, a few years ago. So we'll have to
See where that goes.
see what happens with the trial now.
Thanks, you guys, for being here. Thank you all for watching. And, of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.